my kids, this will be my third pickleball. We had 1 week we got sent out. 1 week the other team worked. And then I played with Benny the first week. Then he was out of town, so I played with Ryan. Then Benny gets hurt, and Ryan is out of town. Yeah, Benny hurt like his ankle or something. That's right. He says he's not gonna be able to play like so like Benny was the one who like made this team. Yeah. And I'm just with a different person.
All right. Good afternoon. Sorry for the late start. Had a good time at dinner at the cellar and then couldn't find my coat. So yeah, sitting out there in the cold trying to figure out where it was. I need to just memorize the stupid thing. So anyway, so we're going to be on 1st and 2nd Corinthians tonight. It's chapter 21. And background here is archaeological ruin in Corinth. This is from a school in Corinth. I just thought it looked cool. So if we can get PowerPoint to work, we'll move forward to the next slide. That'd be cool. There we go. So Corinth was capital in Achaia. Achaia is an ancient way of saying Greece. And so in that region, and a nice little layout there of the city. So you can see the theater and Temple of Apollo. You notice there the Erastus inscription that we actually have found that. That's why it's labeled there. And so I'll show you an image of that momentarily so we can see. It's likely that that person is someone that is mentioned in scripture. So we'll talk about that momentarily. Corinth is probably around 80,000 with 20,000 in the Corinthian suburbs, so to speak. Important port city that's linked Aegean and Ionian seas, and it was a Greco-Roman hybrid. Corinth is it's kind of like an ancient Vegas. There's just a lot. There's a lot going on there. Yeah, it's kind of crazy. One example of that is these are archaeological remains of a temple to Asclepius, who was actually probably a historical person who then became a god of healing. And so what you would do is if you needed healing, you would make a clay version of the thing that needed to be healed, and that was an offering to Asclepius. And so some of the things that we have are not really PG or PG-13 rated that needed to be healed. But we also have, hands and legs and stuff like that too. So, but there's some stuff that, yeah. So I didn't zoom in on any of that. So lest someone be scandalized. David De Silva is a solid New Testament scholar, and I found this on Logos Bible software. He's got these slides, so I just stole them. But I'm attributing, so it's it's academia, it's not theft, because I'm saying where I got it, right? Citing my sources. So he goes through Corinth with some good pictures and some explanations of what's there. Corinth is located on this isthmus between the Aegean and Adriatic seas, which I just think that's just a neat picture, right? To kind of get an idea of what things look like in Corinth. As a result of being close to the sea and being a port city, lots of trade and profit there. You have a lot of markets and all that kind of stuff, right? Ships unloaded there and yada, yada, yada. Nero attempted to cut a canal across this in 67, but didn't work out. Which is saying something, because Nero was pretty insistent on succeeding in anything that he did. And so that he failed, it's kind of a big deal. And so this didn't actually happen until modern engineering came around to make it possible. Paul comes to Corinth, and the city is growing pretty rapidly. And these archaeological ruins we can see here, I mean, that's pretty impressive stonework there, right? Making all of those nice sharp cuts. That looks pretty fantastic. So so this is in this economic growth. Paul, as a tradesperson himself, has a pretty great opportunity to reach out to people in the city through his business and try to spread the gospel, not the gospel, while he is, going about his trade. This is a ruin of connected shops that run along the city. The grassy area would have been walkway of long covered portico or columned porches, which ran all the way across the shops. So just cool image, right? There's also shops near the temple of Hera, and there's other temples as well, Temple of Apollo and Asclepius, like I mentioned, stuff like that. There's a lot of religion in Corinth, a lot of various religions. Another market is in the north of the city. And again, we have rows and rows of shops like we've seen before in Thessalonica even, pretty similar to that. So Paul probably worked in one of these, and we see Priscilla or Prisca and Aquila also doing the same sort of thing. And Prisca is just like an abbreviation for Priscilla. It's kind of like saying Andy instead of Andrew, or something like that. So Prisca or Priscilla and Aquila. And we see those them in Acts, right? Claudius expels the Jews from Rome in 49, which will be incredibly important when we talk about our next chapter on the book of Romans, because him expelling the Jews from Rome in 49 pretty dramatically impacts the church in Rome and the makeup of the church in Rome. So when he does that, Prisca and Aquila relocate to Corinth, and they set up shop. And this is right before Paul shows up, which we see in Acts 18, 1-3. And so this is when Paul gets there. This is likely around 50 or 51. We know this because Acts tells us that there's a guy named Gallio who is ruling in Corinth, and we know when he ruled. We know it was right around 50 or 51, so we know that's when Paul was there. And the image on the right here, this is the Acropolis in Corinth, there on the top of that hill. So after his departure, there are other teachers who show up, and they cause problems. We see this in the letter where Paul says, some of you say that you're of Apollo, or some are of Peter, or some are of Paul. And then you've got the people who, pull the Jesus card and say, I'm of Jesus, right? The Jesus juke. And Paul's like, none of that stuff matters. You shouldn't do any of that stuff. It's stupid, right? So he writes this letter to the Corinthians and urges them with regard to their sexually immoral behavior, and some of this pretty startling stuff. In 1 Corinthians 5, there's the guy who was either sleeping with his mom or his mother-in-law, and Paul says even the Gentiles would not do this, right? And saying that in Corinth is that's saying something, right? Like imagine someone in Vegas saying, none of the people in Vegas would do this, right? It's like, this is not a good thing, right? You shouldn't do this. And so for a Christian to do that would be particularly terrible, right? So he receives questions from the Corinthians and learned of various problems, and responds by writing 1 Corinthians in 53, which, like I mentioned before, 1 Corinthians is actually 2 Corinthians. There's a letter before 1 Corinthians that we just don't have. And 2 Corinthians then is 3 Corinthians, or debatably perhaps multiple letters kind of patched together, but we'll get to that in a second. So he received news that his instructions had not been heeded, and visited Corinth in person, but was unsuccessful in his visit. So Paul's imprisoned in Ephesus. He writes the letter in tears, which had a powerful effect on the Corinthians, and starts the journey back to Corinth after being released from prison, but received news that the church had responded well and reaffirmed their affirmation for Paul. But we're now interacting with the super apostles. All right, so unmute me and go back to sharing the screen. And hopefully that won't happen again. Okay. The super apostles are these people who are like bragging about all of the fantastic exploits that they have had as ministers. And so Paul responds to this somewhat sarcastically by talking about all of the bad things that have happened to him, right? And so they seem to be bragging about, here's how many miracles we've performed and how many people we've raised from the dead and all of this kind of stuff. And Paul responds and he's like, yeah, well, I've been beaten 5 times, right? And so kind of like goes in a different direction, right? Proposals for the problem in Corinth, it kind of varies a little bit, though likely the last one here is probably correct. Gnosticism, for a while, people thought that this teaching of Gnosticism existed in the first century. It almost certainly did not, but we hadn't really figured that out until fairly recently. Gnosticism is sort of like kind of an emphasis on secret knowledge, right? So like things, conspiracy theory kind of thinking that like I'm the only person that knows the real truth. And usually that secret knowledge has something to do with the flesh and the spirit, where the spirit is better than the flesh. That kind of teaching probably doesn't occur in any kind of fully formed sense until the 2nd century. But early on, people thought that that's what was happening in Corinth. So if you were to look at a commentary on Corinthians from, like the 1800s or something, they might talk about Gnosticism. There's also a theory that there's sort of over-realized eschatology, that the new age has already fully dawned. This is kind of the idea that like the guy who's sleeping with his mom or his mother-in-law is sort of like, we're already living in the new age, so we can do whatever we want, right? Like Jesus has inaugurated the kingdom of God. We are living in the kingdom of God. And so then our behavior doesn't matter, right? We can do whatever we want, it's fine. That might be the case. There's also this sort of pagan thinking. Richard Hayes, who's a New Testament scholar out of Duke, has argued that the problem in Corinth is that they are thinking in terms of pagan wisdom rather than the reworked Jewish worldview taught by Paul. And so the second and the third options here, it's probably either one of those or a combination of the two. Those sorts of things are happening. And basically over-realized eschatology would be pagan wisdom, right? Going back to De Silva's slides, this kind of makes sense of some of the stuff that Paul says in Corinthians, talking about the meat that's offered to idols. There's the central meat market, and it's called a Macellum, in the northeast quarter, and this is originally a shrine to Apollo, but eventually it's basically just a meat market, right? And so Paul says in 10:25, eat whatever is sold in the meat market without raising any question on the ground of conscience. And so he's probably referring to this space, right? And that's kind of a big issue in the first century, is trying to figure out how to navigate. I mean, this is a cultural issue, right? Trying to figure out like, how do we navigate, if the meat market, if this meat has been offered to idols in the process of being brought to market, then can I rightfully take that meat without being party to the sacrifice to the idol, right? This is kind of a big issue. Corinth grows, and here's the Erastus inscription. You can kind of see, you sort of imagine an E in the top right or top left there, and you see the R-A-S-T, and then V is how they would make U's, because it's kind of hard to make a U when you're carving in rock. And so that's Erastus there. And so, so this is the Erastus inscription that I pointed out in the map of Corinth. He seems to be a pretty important person, overseeing a lot of different stuff. And you can actually still go see this Erastus inscription. And likely this, if you remember the honor and shame stuff that we talked about, man, that would have been, I think, last semester. This sort of inscription indicates honor, right? You've given something to the city, and so people want to display that you have been generous so that your name increases in honor. And so Erastus likely has done something fairly significant, right? And in Romans 16:23, Paul tells us that he's the city treasurer and that he's become part of the Christian congregation. Now, it's possible it's not the same Erastus, but I mean, you know, also possible it's the same one. So who knows? There's this monument, and this kind of gets you, I think, does a pretty good job of getting you into the mentality of what it's like to be a Corinthian. This is the top of a Corinthian column, and if you're familiar at all with Greek architecture, there are, I think, at least 3 and possibly as many as like 6 types of columns. And this is the Corinthian one. The Corinthian one is far and away the most elaborate, and some of the other ones are just a straight column with nothing particular special on it. Well, this one in particular is a part of this monument to this guy, and this guy actually made it himself. He paid for a monument to himself, kind of to say look at how great I am, right? And the monument would have kind of looked something like this, this sort of mentality, the fact that happened in Corinth, and the fact that he wasn't openly mocked about it in Corinth, kind of shows you what the mentality in Corinth was, that you could erect a monument to yourself and no one would really bat an eye, right? That you have this sort of kind of self-serving mentality of, I want everyone to look at me and see how fantastic I am. And everyone in Corinth is like, yeah, that's what you're supposed to do, right? That this guy would do that, right? There's also a fairly decent Jewish population. Paul's time in Corinth seems to have upset them pretty significantly. And so you can read about that in Acts 18. And this is an inscription from a synagogue, which essentially says gathering of the Hebrews. You can kind of see there on the bottom right, HEB, and then what looks like a P in Greek, the letter rho is looks like a P. So that's Hebrew there. And then we also have some inscriptions of menorahs and stuff like that to kind of confirm for us this Jewish population there. Opposition to Paul in trying to create a church there in Corinth comes from this guy Gallio that I talked about. And I think I showed an inscription of Gallio back when we did the lesson on the resurrection, that we actually have inscriptions from his rule there. And so this building here, this is the headquarters of the governor, which would have been his headquarters. So this is where he would have done his business and, opposed Paul. This is the Bema seat. This is the judgment seat. And there are Bema seats in several different locations, but the one in Corinth is particularly famous. And this is where the Jewish community basically accuses Paul and says, here's someone who has agitated us and broken the law and that sort of thing. And they bring him up to Gallio and try to get him to convict Paul. Gallio determines that it's an internal affair, that it's just between Jews, and so he doesn't really want to get involved in it. But yeah, so this is the Bema seat, and so this is where that would have occurred. There's another picture of that from a kind of a different perspective. And you can kind of get an idea, from the size of that, and then you can kind of see the seat itself, how distinctly white that is, and how big that would have been. This would have been a pretty imposing place, to come to a court and have someone sitting up on something like that. That would have been pretty terrifying. So, as usual, I want to talk a little bit about Ehrman's perspective. Ehrman isn't going to diverge too much on 1 Corinthians. Not a lot of debate here with him. From his perspective, questionable behavior has developed in the church since Paul has left, which is what we've already covered. There's socioeconomic diversity, which we haven't touched on really, but that exists and has led to sort of disunity. It looks like we've got like something popping up in Zoom here. I want to make sure it doesn't like crash on me again. Give me just a second. I'm sorry? Okay. Can't get it to pop back up. What in the heck? Come on now. There we go. There we go. Yeah, chat. There we go. Oh, yeah, John, that's a good question. Yeah, so he says in the chat, architectural element with the menorah weren't a lot of the synagogues in personal homes and not in like specific areas. Yeah, most of the synagogues were in personal homes, but you do start to see some specifically built where there are large Jewish populations in bigger cities like Corinth. You do start to see some synagogues built in those cities to house those populations. And you see this with Christians too, even in the first century. It's not super common, but it does exist. And it's also possible that the menorah was someone who just had a whole lot of money that was Jewish and they put that up in their house. But most likely that it was a synagogue and that there was just a fairly decent sized Jewish population, especially given the amount of influence that they seem to have had politically with getting an audience with Gallio and that sort of thing. There's probably some kind of significant population there. So, but yeah, that's a good question, John. Thanks for that. I'll leave the chat up on my computer here just in case you pop something else in. So, so socioeconomic diversity, we see this. The easiest example here is when Paul talks about communion, talks about how some people are dead because they're doing it wrong, which is kind of an extreme thing to say, right? That some of you have fallen asleep because of the way that you've gone about communion. And basically what he seems to be saying there is that the wealthy people are showing up early and they're eating all of the food and drinking all of the wine. And then when the poorer people show up, they have nothing to eat. And so it seems to be that he's saying that the poorer people aren't getting food and are thus malnourished and are thus susceptible to death. And so those people are dying because other people are doing this wrong, right? And so, but this is what leads to Catholic tradition and Orthodox tradition of what's called guarding the table in communion, such that if you are not Catholic, you are not permitted to take communion at a Catholic church, because from their perspective, they're guarding you from potentially like drinking judgment to yourself, right? That you are violating this. Now, in context, I don't think that that's actually what Paul's saying there, but it is kind of startling to read Paul saying that, people are dying because you're doing communion wrong. It's kind of terrifying. In 1 Corinthians, Paul demands higher ethical standards. Pretty similar to what we've seen before. Primary message is Christ crucified. We see this in 1 Corinthians 15, which is the hallmark passage on the resurrection. I gave to you that which I also received, and then goes on into the Christ was crucified according to the scriptures, that he was buried, and he was raised according to the scriptures, and that seems to go back pretty close to the cross. Notice that many of the problems are rooted in the Corinthians' erroneous belief that they're already exalted, and so in this way, Ehrman is siding with option number 2 regarding the problem of Corinthians. And exaltation will only occur in the future with Jesus' return, but for now, evil is reigning. One thing that's worth pointing out with regard to Ehrman and Corinthians is one of the reasons that he rejects the authorship of the pastorals is that 1 Timothy 8-15 indicates that women can't teach men, right? You have do not permit a woman to teach a man or to have authority over a man, but to remain in silence and submission. And so Paul sees that and he says, well, or Paul sees that, Airman, sorry. Airman sees that and says, well, Paul affirmed women in ministry, so he wouldn't have written something like that. Well, the thing that throws me about that is 1 Corinthians has a passage like that. 1 Corinthians in 14:34 says women should be silent in the churches, for they are not permitted to speak, but should be subordinate, as the law also says. Now, one thing about this that you may be wondering is, what does it mean, as the law also says? No one knows. This is one of those places in the New Testament that we're like, don't have an idea what Paul's trying to get out there, because there's not really anything in the law that seems to indicate that women should be silent or that women should not be allowed to speak in a congregational setting. And so it just seems kind of odd there. A lot of different guesses about it, but most people pretty much acknowledge that, man, what is going on there? But like I said, we have a passage here that seems to indicate the same sort of thing that 1 Timothy 2 does. So it's just odd that Airman, he doesn't have a problem with Paul writing 1 Corinthians, and no one else does either. 1 Corinthians is pretty much universally accepted to be Pauline. But he does have a problem with 1 Timothy, even though, his reason for that is in conflict with his reason for 1 Corinthians. Now, in response to that, I would say that silent here can't actually mean literal silence, because if we go back to 1 Corinthians 11, Paul actually says, if a woman prays or prophesies in the church, here's how she ought to do that. Well, one would expect that prayer and prophecy in the church would include some sort of sound. And so then within 3 chapters, Paul is giving us instructions for how women can make sounds in the church. So he can't mean like literal silence here. He has to mean something else. So there has to be some sort of interpretation involved. But point being that Airman rejects Paul writing 1 Timothy on grounds that should also force him to reject Paul writing 1 Corinthians, and yet he doesn't. And so that's always kind of puzzled me. So the image here, by the way, is not a Christian image. This is just a Greco-Roman image. And I find this to be a fascinating image, because we tend to think in the Greco-Roman world that women weren't educated. It was this patriarchal society and all that kind of stuff. And that, I'm not trying to say that that isn't true at all. But we do have artwork like this showing a woman reading a book and ostensibly taking notes in it, right? And so it seems like there's at least some women being educated, right? And then later on, we have evidence of other women being educated and stuff like that. But with regard to this question, I think that's just a fascinating little piece of artwork. So integrity of 2 Corinthians. Moving on to 2 Corinthians, or 4th, 5th, and 6th Corinthians, or however you take it. Some argue that it's at least 5 smaller letters. They're broken up into those divisions. So you have 2 Corinthians 8, which is Paul's first attempt, 2 Corinthians 2 to 2 Corinthians 7, minus a short section, which is Paul's response to questions about his ministry. This is where you get a lot of the super apostle stuff. And then 2 Corinthians 10 to 13, which is his letter of tears, defending his credentials. Now, a lot of people see it that way. I don't know that it's. I don't know that there's really any good reason to see it that way. Wright and Berg don't buy it, and I don't either. 2 Corinthians, you see these passages. Paul rejoices in reconciliation to the Corinthians, and then 9, Paul's later circular to the churches of Achaia about the collection. So it seems like there's not really any evidence to suggest that there are these 5 separate letters, right? There doesn't seem to be like a good way to approach that that's really compelling. You can kind of there are some reasons to believe it, but they're just not. I don't find them sufficient, right? It's kind of like the arguments against Paul writing the pastorals. Yeah, some of this stuff sounds like it's not Paul, but for you to really say that Paul didn't write that, the amount of evidence that you would have to marshal for that is pretty astounding. And you haven't really done it, right? And so it's the same thing here. Like, it's a neat theory, but the evidence that would be required in order to really persuade on that would be quite a bit more than what they give us. Plus, there's quotations from this stuff early on in the church, so there's all sorts of other reasons not to accept it. So, outline for 1 Corinthians, which I probably should have put earlier in the presentation. I missed that. Letter opening, and then we have God's wisdom and Corinthian factions. And we have sex and Corinthian bodies. All creation belongs to God, but must not be worshipped. And then worship glorifies God. Resurrection of the body, which is 1 Corinthians 15, which I mentioned before. And then letter closing. In 2 Corinthians, Paul defends his ministry. Paul's ministry is an ambassador of reconciliation, calls to complete the collection, and Paul versus the super apostles, right? So there seems to be some continuity there. Airman on 2 Corinthians, forgot to change my font here, dang it. I hate that. I've had consistent font all the way through here, and this one, forgot to change it. It's the little things that frustrate you, the little things. 2 Corinthians for Airman, he buys into compilation of 2 letters. That's his perspective. The differences in the letters help us trace Paul's relationship with the Corinthian community. And so after 1 Corinthians, Paul is humiliated. And soon after, you have these super apostles that come in and contradict what Paul has said. So 2 Corinthians 10 to 13 reflects Paul's anger towards the super apostles. Paul rejected their view. And their view was essentially that, look at all the great things that we've done, and so everything's going to be great. We can all do all these great things. And then 1 Corinthians 1 to 9 is a grateful conciliatory letter expressing joy that the Corinthians realigned themselves to Paul. And so, I mean, the strongest argument, and this is the argument that Ehrman makes, is that you have such a significant shift in tone here that it seems like they're 2 different letters. But Paul can be really happy about one thing and then really mad about another thing, and both of those things go in the same letter, right? So it just seems, not sufficient to be able to, take this and say, this is what we're going to deal with. So, cool. Okay, so that is 1 and 2 Corinthians, not as, long as I thought it might have been. Yeah. So, any questions on this, you guys? Any questions on this, John? We can just move on to Romans if you guys want, because wouldn't hurt us to make a little bit more progress if we have the opportunity. So
I have kind of a question. What order are you going through these books in?
I'm just going through in the order of the book. Okay. So New Testament in its world.
Do you know why they did it in the order?
I think they're aligning the work to. They're basically summarizing N.T. Wright's work. And so I think they're ordering things according to his works already, instead of ordering them according to the canon. Yeah.
Curious.
No, I mean, it's a good question. That'd be my guess. They might say something like that in the book. I don't recall if they have an explanation for it, but I'd be willing to bet that the arrangement of the work pertains to the overall themes that N.T. Wright has worked through, and so they're arranging it according to that instead of arranging it according to the canon. So, yeah. So I'm not just making up the order. Like, I'm not just like, well, let's do 2 Corinthians this sound. Let's just skip to Revelation. Whatever, right? Yeah. So, Paul seems a little defensive responding to these attacks and resorts to a bit of boasting that he warns them about. Yeah, that's a good point. I think, most of the boasting that he goes into is, if memory serves, I mean, I might be missing something, but most of the boasting that he goes into is regarding his suffering, right? Like, he's been shipwrecked, he's been beaten, all of that kind of stuff. And so I think he's kind of trying to show the boasting that they're doing in their super apostolicity, or whatever you would call it, that they're boasting in their power and he's boasting in weakness. and that in so doing, he's aligning himself with Jesus, who suffered for our sake, and not aligning himself with this like hubris that the super apostles have. At least that seems to be, kind of what's going on to me. Now, I may be missing something in the text. There might be something that's a little bit more overtly arrogant, but that's the way that it makes sense to me. Is that helpful, John? Am I addressing what you're asking sufficiently? Yeah, okay. Power and weakness. Yeah. That seems to be what he's trying to go for, right? That I mean, he even says, I can't remember if this is in Corinthians or in one of his other letters. I forget where this is, but he says that he is even like completing the sufferings of Christ in his own sufferings. I forget where he says that. But yeah, he seems to be really keen on that sort of stuff, right? That even like with the thorn in the flesh, right? That's in Corinthians. That he's like, God, take this from me, and God's like, no, my power is made perfect in your weakness, right? And I actually had a former student ask me earlier today. It's like, what do you think the thorn in the flesh was? And my personal opinion, my personal professional opinion, is that the thorn in the flesh was stupid people. I think it's one thing that you see in ministry is that there are some people who just want to ask questions, but they don't want to like ever go anywhere with it, right? They don't want to like develop or grow. They just want to like bother you, right? And it's just like that gets old, it gets kind of like it kind of wears on you to the point where you start to see these people and you're like, oh, just like this person again, like, and yeah, and so I think that's the thorn in his flesh is people that are just not interested in growth or development or anything like that. They're only interested in just kind of piling on and just grinding them down. I did see a meme one time that had showed Paul writing in prison, and above his head was the like thought bubble where he's writing, I had a thorn in my flesh, and it's the second section from Corinthians, and then under that thought bubble, he's chained up to the wall beside SpongeBob, and SpongeBob is like, "Hey, what you doing, Paul? What you doing? Who you writing to? What's going on, Paul? What do you think, Paul?" Like, it just like keeps like all this stuff, and yeah, so SpongeBob is the thorn in the flesh. So yeah, anyway, okay, so let's see if we can cover at least a little bit of Romans. That would help us in our overall progress here. So see if I can't get that up here. Okay. Actually, cool. Okay. All right. Let me see if I got that in the way that I need to. Is that still shared? Okay, cool. All right. So chapter 22, Romans. We got the Colosseum here. And that's kind of the quintessential thing for Rome. Funny, the Colosseum is built over where Nero's palace was built. And Nero had built this like god-awful statue of himself that was like, 50 feet high or something, and completely naked, right? So like 50-foot high statue of Nero just standing there in all of his glory. And so when they got rid of him, they redid the statue so that it would be a god. So they made it, I think they made it into like Saturn or something. And then they built the Colosseum over the ruins of his palace. So anyway, this I like this. This is just an interesting like tidbit to look at the inside of the Colosseum. The floor for the Colosseum actually would have gone over all of that stuff in the center there. So they actually have like, you can kind of see this in like, if you watch the Gladiator, right? They'll have like trap doors that open that animals can come out of and stuff like that. And so that, the Colosseum was really just a remarkable feat of engineering. The stuff that they did with that, they could completely seal it off and flood it so they could have naval battles. inside of the Coliseum, all sorts of stuff like that. And so it's pretty crazy, the kind of stuff that they could do there. So Rome, again, we're going to steal some stuff from David Da Silva. Da Silva is just phenomenal. If you're looking for somebody else to read on the New Testament, he is probably the best person writing on the New Testament right now, specifically with regard to cultural background. N.T. Wright's phenomenal for theology and New Testament studies. Mike Bird is phenomenal for theology and New Testament studies. Da Silva has just done such a wonderful job of reclaiming like all the honor shame stuff. And yeah, he's got two lecture series on cultural background for the New Testament on YouTube that you can go to YouTube and just search for David Da Silva, and you've got all these lectures just on Bible background for New Testament. So it's fantastic. He explains, I think he goes through the Apocrypha too, goes book by book in the Apocrypha to explain what we should know about the Apocrypha. So Rome is obviously the heart of the empire. It's kind of interesting to think about. You think about like the Greek Empire, that is the empire of a state or a nation. The Roman Empire is the empire of a city, right? And so the Roman Empire is like, I heard a historian, Gerald Bray, one time say that the Roman Empire is essentially the city of Rome just kept expanding the borders of the city, right? So you have this gigantic city, right? And that's kind of an interesting way to think about it, because that is sort of what happens, right? Because it's not the Greek Empire, Alexander the Great, that was not, he didn't expand a city, he expanded a nation, right? It wasn't like the Athenian Empire or something like that. But in Rome, it's the expansion of Rome, the city, right? Their symbol tended to be an eagle, among many other things. This is why you see eagles showing up in America. America's really fond of Rome, and so we like to steal that stuff. You also, if you follow history, the Holy Roman Empire is when Rome really, really becomes Christian, because it's the Holy Roman Empire. That's in about 800, if memory serves. They consider themselves the Second Reich, which is the second rule or the second domain or something like that. And so they pick up a lot of Roman symbolism. Well, then the Third Reich is Nazi Germany, and they do the same thing, right? If you look at Nazi Germany iconography, they use a lot of Roman influence, right? They pick up that same sort of influence. And so just interesting to see those connections in history. So city is, as John would describe it in Revelation, the great city that rules over kings of the earth. It's also parasitic and insatiable. And so Rome is quite a thing. First century Rome, I think the city proper, like the original city, I think it was like 90% slaves, 90 or 95% slaves. And the life expectancy for a slave was about 23 years old. And so the people that Paul is writing the letter to, when he's writing to the Roman church, most of those people are slaves, right? And they are probably going to die in their mid-20s. And so that's pretty astounding to think about when we're reading the book, right? Public architecture in the city was designed above all to impress and create propaganda for its leaders, like Nero having a 50-foot statue of himself. And so everything that they did, it was all, the power and the glory of Rome, right? Trying to show how superior Rome is to everybody else. If Rome is the heart of the empire, Roman Forum is the heart of Rome. And so this is where you have the politics and the imperial piety, because politics in Rome kind of blended a little bit with religion, because you have the imperial cult where the emperor himself is in some sense a god. And so you have kind of religion and politics kind of blending, which we know nothing about, right? Religion and politics blending. Sorry, that was probably too much. Shouldn't say that. Shouldn't say that. And so, so this is where you see that happening, right? The imperial cult is coming in pretty strongly. And this is where, even in like Philippians, we mentioned this when we talked about Philippians, that you can call Jesus God all you want, but you can't call Jesus Lord. Only Caesar is Lord. And so saying that Jesus is Lord is not only a theological statement, it's a political statement. And so, same thing's happening here. Philippi considers itself little Rome in the ancient world. One of the ancient temples here is dedicated to Vesta. This is where the Vestal Virgins, if you've ever heard of them, Vestal Virgins, and they tend the eternal flame of the city of Rome. And and so you have these priestesses, the Vestal Virgins, and that is the it's symbolic of the entire city of Rome, right? That fire goes out, Rome is over, right? So it is the symbolic of the entire city. So key places for Rome. I don't know why I suddenly have transitions here. I need to get my stuff together here, right? All over the place, guys. Changing fonts, having transitions, not having transitions. So it's written from Corinth, likely, and he's probably going to Jerusalem, but hoping to go to them and then hoping to go on from them to Spain. It's kind of a joke among New Testament scholars sometimes that Romans is the world's longest support letter. That Paul writes this gigantic thing, and you ask people like, what's the point of Romans? What's the purpose of Romans? What motivated Paul to write Romans? And everybody goes off into all of these like theological things about like, he's trying to explain salvation, he's trying to explain forgiveness, and at the end of the day, you read the end of Romans and it's like, give me money, right? It's like he's like, I'm hoping that you will help me on my way to you and to continue on to Spain. And so it's this like support letter. He's asking them for money. So how important was it for Paul to engage Rome because it was the center of power? Did he see it that way? And his message, if accepted there, would be hugely significant, or was it just another place to build a church? That's a good question. That's a good question. I'm not sure. I think Paul would have seen it as an important place, but also the people that he's reaching in Rome weren't particularly important. He's reaching a lot of slaves. And so I don't know that he would have seen the church in Rome necessarily as some like super influential thing that would have been a foothold, though at the same time, he does use it sort of as a staging ground to go on to Spain. So, yeah, I'm not sure. That's a good question. I'm not sure which way I'd go on that. Not that I'm like the world leading expert on the topic, but yeah.
Why do you think that we sent us
It's their poor. Yeah. Because it's really probably the only place that he can go from towards Spain. There's not any place on the western part of the Mediterranean where he has any kind of connection that he can move from there on to Spain. And there might be a couple of people they're not all slaves, they're just mostly slaves. And so there might be some people in there that are affluent, and not all slaves were dirt poor, they just weren't particularly influential. Or at least like directly influential. If you were the slave of somebody important, you might be able to influence the important person, right? In some way, if you were like their personal servant or something like that. But yeah, there's nothing, if you think about all the other places that he writes to, there's nothing on that side of the empire that he can use as kind of a staging ground to move on to Spain. And it does seem like he actually makes it to Spain and then comes back from Spain to Rome and then gets killed in the late 60s in Rome. That seems to be what probably happens in like 68 or 69 in Nero's persecution. It seems like Paul and Peter are both in Rome, and they both get killed by Nero. So, yeah. So Paul's third missionary journey. This kind of shows you some of his movements here to give you an idea of where he's going. Shows you where Corinth is, where Athens is, all that kind of stuff. And then you can kind of see where Thessalonica is, kind of see where he's trying to move up into and over to Rome, trying to get over there. So yeah, kind of see his route there. The one thing to talk about that is important here, and we'll probably just end with this and then pick up with this, cover it again next time because it's really important, is what we mentioned earlier with Claudius expelling the Jews from Rome. If you read Acts chapter 2, when you have the day of Pentecost, there are proselytes from Rome in Jerusalem at the day of Pentecost, which is kind of interesting. And so you have these people who are in Rome at Pentecost when all of that happens and when Peter preaches his sermon. And so ostensibly some of those people accept the gospel and then go back to Rome. Well, those would be proselytes and Jews. So they go back to Rome, and in 49, all of the Jews are expelled from Rome. So you have these Gentiles who have converted to Judaism/Christianity, and then you have Jews who have accepted Jesus as the Messiah, and they have a church together. And then the Jews are forced to leave. Well, what does that do to the dynamic of the church? It's now completely Gentile, right? And so that impacts the dynamic of the church pretty significantly. Well, 5 years later, Claudius dies, and the Jews start to return. Well, what kind of church do they come back to? A Gentile church, right? And so here they have founded this church with proselytes who have come to faith with them. They've left, and 5 years later they come back, and what they have fought for is kind of no longer there. And then a couple of years after that, the book of Romans is written, right? And so Paul is writing Romans to a church that is in internal strife, that the Jews and the Gentiles, I mean, I've kind of joked about this, that like if you just guess, Paul wrote it in jail about a conflict between Jews and Gentiles, that you'll probably be right. Well, it's specifically true here in Romans that you have this tension and outright conflict between Jews and Gentiles in the church, that the Gentiles have become comfortable with this Gentile church, and the Jews are upset that what they planted has changed, right? So can you imagine being a slave? This comes from when I took undergrad, a class in Romans. My professor used to use this to kind of illustrate to us the tension. And I think it just works perfectly. I mean, if you can imagine being a slave that's 20 years old, you're going to live for maybe another 5 years. And you come home after 12 or 14 hours of work, and you're Jewish, you come home, and your fellow Christians, it's someone else's turn to cook the dinner that night. And what do they cook? Pork. And you're gonna die in 5 years. You just worked 14 hours. You get home and your Christian brother serves you pork. You're like, you asshole, right? like, how dare you? You know, I mean, that is a significant ethnic tension that is pretty hard to resolve, right? And so this is really what Paul's trying to deal with. He's trying in Romans to say, there's nothing wrong with being Jewish. It's important to be Jewish, but you don't have to be Jewish, right? And it's good that you're, so he's trying to like please both sides while confronting both sides while trying to maintain some kind of balance. And it's all because of this kind of hot mess here. So cool. So that takes us to 7 o'clock. We could keep rolling for a little bit, but I'm just gonna be honest with you guys. I'm wiped. It's a long day, and so we got through 1st and 2nd Corinthians. We got a little bit of a start into Romans, so we'll pick this up next week. So, cool. Don, thanks for your questions, sir.
We have a inaugural game at 8:15.
You gotta kill some time.
So you guys were hoping I would keep going, huh?